Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Dauenhauer. I'm an associate professor at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado. I'll be speaking to you today on evidence-based physical activity promotion in school settings. I would like to start off just by thanking the organizers of the IOHSK conference for inviting me to speak here. I wish I could be with many of you in Las Vegas, but hopefully this recorded session is of value. I have been at the University of Northern Colorado for 10 years, and my research interests lie at the intersection of school-based physical activity and effective data use. So I think those interests and expertise will come out in this keynote presentation. So to start off with today, I would like to cover three main issues. First, talking about what is evidence-based practice. And so it's important to come to a clear definition of what that is. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we know works in terms of physical activity promotion in school settings. And then we'll end talking a little bit about how we can capitalize on local data. And in my opinion, this is a very necessary step. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing we'll begin with is defining evidence-based practice. So the graphic that I'm sharing with you on the screen has been adopted by the CDC by Jacobs and colleagues, published in 2012. I like this definition of evidence-based practice because it acknowledges more than just the research that we currently have. So if we look here at this top circle, we see that evidence-based practice is primarily determined by the best research evidence that we have. Okay, but oftentimes we might only think of evidence-based practice as doing what the research says works. However, as you can see in this model, evidence-based practice goes well beyond what we know just from the research. If we're truly doing evidence-based practice, we also need to consider the population that we're working with. We need to consider the characteristics of the community, the needs, values, and preferences, not only of the target population. So if we're talking about school-based physical activity, we're looking at students primarily, but we're also talking about the teachers, we're talking about the administrators, the parents and the families, and even the larger school community with other folks that are involved in the schools. So that has to be considered when we're thinking about evidence-based practice. We also need to consider the resources that are available within a school community. So these resources could be human resources, or they could be other types of sort of, more tangible resources that a school community has access to. And then finally, we consider the basic context of the school community. When we think about all these different things, the intersection that lies in the middle that's labeled decision-making here, that's where evidence-based practice truly lies, is considering all three of these things. So let's dive in a little bit further into each of these. So first of all, when we're talking about the best available research evidence, I think it's important to acknowledge, first of all, that research does not and has not answered all the questions that are out there. We know what works to a certain extent, but there's different levels of evidence that we can consider when we're trying to understand best practices, in particular in a school setting. So if we look at the bottom of this image here, we see that there's expert opinion and some of these maybe more conceptual pieces that might be written on a topic that we would consider at the base level. Then we go into some individual studies that might be done to collect evidence of impact or effect or outcomes. And these go all the way up to, sort of that most rigorous form of research, which are randomized controlled trials. But then when we're really talking about evidence-based practice, we want to shoot for those highest tiers of evidence. And generally speaking, those are your systematic reviews and meta-analyses. These broader works that look at multiple studies across multiple populations, and really ask the question, what is the overall effect of the interventions that have been done in this particular area? Okay, so when we're looking at evidence-based practice, we want to draw on systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and then we also can look to other research syntheses. And so these may look like guidance documents, for example, from national organizations that really dive deep into the literature and use the research to guide the best practices. These could also be books that are written on a topic that really look closely at the research and what the evidence says in terms of the best practices. So these are the kinds of things that we want to search for. In some cases, they're available. In some cases, they're not. And I'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about school-based physical activity promotion. The second piece, the circle on the bottom left, was considering community characteristics. And this includes the needs, values, and preferences of a school community. And as I mentioned, the school community is large and includes a lot of different stakeholders. And so there needs to be ways that we understand truly what's going on in the school community. We could look at things like online databases that can give us information about the basic demographics of a school community. We can also look to other school databases that give us a sense of a school's mission and vision, sort of how they're performing in different areas of academics. But in all honesty, we need to have some kind of on-the-ground knowledge of the school community. It needs to be the people who are truly embedded on a day-to-day basis in the school community. Those are the ones who really understand the characteristics of the school community and what those needs, values, and preferences are. Stakeholders can also use surveys, and this is a common practice. You can survey students, you can survey teachers, you can survey parents. And this is sort of a formal way of understanding the community characteristics and their needs, values, and preferences. Okay, also, we need to understand the community resources that are available. Okay, so as I mentioned, these can be human resources. This could be everything from just the number of personnel or staff that are on as personnel in a school setting. These can be the resources of volunteers, community members that are involved in the school community, and then administrators, teachers, all the people who would be involved in that school can be considered these community resources. We can also think of sort of the built environment or the facilities that are around a school. And so these can vary extensively between different communities. And so these have to be considered when we're thinking about evidence-based practice. And then also the one that we might consider most frequently would be the financial resources. And so we want to know, is there funding for physical activity initiatives, health initiatives, and how much is allocated? Are there grants? Those sorts of things would be things we'd want to consider. So if we come back to this model, we're looking at what the research can tell us about the best practices to the extent that we currently know them. And then we want to consider at the same time the characteristics of the school community and the resources that are available at our disposal. So this is what I'm referring to when I talk about evidence-based practice. Okay, so now what works in schools? I think many of us are familiar with the statistics around youth physical activity, and it's right around 25% or so of youth are meeting the 60 minutes per day of physical activity recommendations. And so we know that there is a need to promote physical activity, and we know that schools are a place that kids tend to be for a good portion of their days. So what do we actually know works in school-based physical activity? There have been a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses done on the topic of school-based physical activity promotion. They've included research done in the US and internationally. And we have a reasonable sense of what actually works in schools. I wouldn't say we're at a point where we definitively can say exactly all of the practices that need to be done. Typically, in the systematic reviews that we see, the conclusions include a statement somewhat like more research needs to be done to truly understand the practices or interventions that have the strongest impact in schools. However, there are some takeaway messages from the research that has been done to date, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So in addition to the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, These are some of those other sources of evidence, the research syntheses that I was mentioning before. So we have books like the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Program Handbook that synthesizes a lot of research. We also have some guidebooks from different organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the CDC. We have guidance documents from other organizations like Shape America and the Aspen Institute that talk about youth sports and physical education. And then we've actually had a few special issues published in journals like JOPERD that really look at what the evidence says are the most effective practices in school-based physical activity promotion. What we really know is that a whole of school approach is needed to have any kind of impact on physical activity behavior in youth. And so one of the most common whole of school approaches, at least here in the United States, is the Comprehensive School Physical Activity Program model. Many of you are probably familiar with this model. It includes 5 component areas, starting with the foundational component of quality physical education. Physical education sets the knowledge and skills needed in youth to engage in physical activity, not only now, but for a lifetime. But then we also understand that physical education by itself cannot provide kids with enough physical activity for them to meet national recommendations. So we look at other opportunities for physical activity before, during, and after the school day. So there are before school programs and after school programs, such as intramurals, such as community connected programs like with YMCA enrichment programs and those sorts of things that can happen after the school day. And then we even have things like mileage clubs where kids will walk or run and accumulate miles. During the school day, we have recess and active breaks at the secondary level. And then we have classroom movement integration, where while kids are in the classroom environment, movement is integrated. But the CISPAP model also includes staff involvement and family community engagement. So it starts to acknowledge that there's more than just the physical activity opportunities themselves that are needed. You need to have the adults in the school involved in promoting physical activity for it to truly be successful. And you need to have the entire community involved. So in connection with the CISPAP model is this idea of an ecological systems approach. And Russ Carson and colleagues published a paper back in 2014 that looked at CISPAP within a social ecological systems model. And it looked at some of those adults outside of the actual students participating in the opportunities for physical activity, what kinds of skill sets are needed, what kinds of support is needed. And then it even went out to these larger ideas of policy and culture. And as myself and my team at the UNC Active Schools Institute over the last few years have been really diving into the literature, this idea of a culture has really come to the surface over and over again. And that if we want to have physical activity be an outcome in schools, it really takes much more than just one individual intervention in one section of the school. It needs to be a broader approach. So just this past year, the National Active Schools Movement published a number of guidance documents that really captured the idea of an active school culture. And you'll probably notice, looking at the figure on the right, that the traditional CISPAP model, the 5 components, are embedded within the idea of an active school culture. But similar to what Carson and colleagues did in 2014, it expands from an ecological systems perspective and considers some of the other essential elements that are needed to truly create this culture in school settings that values physical activity. So if you look at the blue ring around the outside, we have school and staff leadership, family community engagement, and planning, implementation, and evaluation. That takes into account some implementation science. Then in our red circle around the outside, we have policy and advocacy and the ongoing needs for professional development and training. Also embedded within this model, and it's in every single component, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that's a really important tenet to share, in that we have to think about physical activity promotion in schools from an equity-minded perspective in terms of how we reach every child, not just our most athletically inclined, but every child in the school needs to have opportunities to be active for 60 minutes a day. So building on the idea of an active school culture, over the past year, Active Schools has created menus of evidence-based practices. And really what these are a synthesis, it's building on a synthesis of the research that's been done in terms of physical activity promotion in schools, but it really distills that research down into the most tangible practices that schools could actually implement. And so if you look at the graphics on this page, you'll see a menu of evidence-based practice for physical activity before and after school. That's broken down into before and after school programs and clubs, active transportation, and youth sports. And each one of those check boxes has a specific action that could be done by a school, with the idea being that there is research to support that as a best practice for schools. Likewise, on the right side, you'll see some of the practices that are involved in school and staff leadership, forming an active school committee, empowering teachers and school staff, and promoting wellness among faculty and staff. So these are the specific practices that have been distilled from the literature, and these resources are available on Active Schools' website. You can see the link below, and they're really designed to be a user-friendly tool for schools to understand evidence-based practice in school physical activity promotion. Okay, so now that we've talked about what evidence-based practices are and define them, and we've talked a little bit about what we know works in terms of school-based physical activity promotion, now the question is, how can we capitalize on local data? So first of all, if we think about the research, there are some limitations in terms of what the research can truly give us and tell us. So typically, no matter how extensive the research is, there could be limits in terms of its generalizability to a specific population or to a specific sample. And so if I'm actually in, let's say, an elementary school setting in Fort Collins, Colorado, my particular unique school setting is likely different than the population and setting that the research was originally conducted in. And that's just a limitation in terms of research, right? And also, when we think about research being implemented in a different school settings and different school contexts, there's always variation in terms of schools, between levels of schools, in terms of grade levels, between urban versus rural environments, and then all the way down to just the unique characteristics of a school setting in and of itself, from facilities and those sorts of things, the built environment. And then also, if we think about some of the research that's been done, especially these large-scale studies that have a lot of funding to go with them, the resources required to actually do the interventions. And so the question of fidelity versus adaptability comes up. And when I talk about fidelity, I'm referring to actually taking exactly what was done in the research and implementing it as close as possibly to what was done in the research in the school setting, versus taking what was done and deliberately adapting it to meet the needs of the school setting that you're in. And what I would argue in this presentation today is that adaptability is more important than fidelity, because it aligns more closely with the definition of evidence-based practice that I presented previously, where it considers the local school context and it considers the resources of the school community. So if we're going to take what's been done in the research and adapt it to our environment and start implementing it, there is a need for local data, an ongoing need for local data, to truly understand if what we're doing is actually having the impact that we desire. So how can that be done? Active Schools has also published an Active Schools Evaluation Handbook. This handbook talks about process and outcome evaluation. Process evaluation referring to the who, what, when, where, and why of programs and of implementation of school physical activity programming. And then also outcome evaluation, which is truly the results or the goals that we were setting in the school for physical activity. And I would note that it's not just physical activity that can be our goals involved in promoting physical activity. We know that there are a bunch of ancillary benefits to physical activity participation that schools might be interested in. Okay, so the Active Schools Evaluation Handbook is another practical guide for schools to understand what tools and measures are available to collect data on a variety of variables of interest around school physical activity. If we take it a step further, in addition to process and outcome data that we might traditionally think of, we can also think of other types of data that are available in schools that we can use to truly understand what's happening in our school context. So input data are the types of data that we would look at in terms of what we have to work with. This could be equipment availability. This could be the size of the population that we're dealing with, or the days that we can actually meet with kids and with students. It's the what we work with kind of data that is important in truly understanding how we might try to build in evidence-based practices. We can also look at data called satisfaction data. And this is where we dive into truly understanding what our key stakeholders really care about, what their desires are, and whether they're satisfied, the extent to which they're satisfied with the current programming that might be going on in this school. And so these 4 different types of data are the types of things we want to consider when we're truly seeing if we have the type of impact we're looking for in our school community. These 4 types of data can drive our practice in 4 main areas. And just as a side note, this model of these 4 types of data has been used in education for many years. The Institute of Educational Sciences has a great research brief that talks about these different types of data and how they can be used in schools to promote academics. I'm simply transferring these over into physical activity promotion. And so these types of data can inform the types of decisions we might make around curriculum and instruction, whether this is in a traditional physical education setting or in programming that happens outside of physical education, like in before and after school physical activity programs, or even recess. These data also can drive ongoing program improvement efforts. And this is really a big one because the idea of data-driven practice is really all about continuous improvement. And so when we're thinking about, knowing what's happened in the research and then trying to understand when we actually implement some of these practices in our own school, it's not always going to turn out perfect the first time that we do it. And so this is a cyclical process that happens constantly, where we're collecting different types of data to truly understand what's happening, and then we continually improve and continually adapt our programming so that we get the outcomes that we're looking for. And then finally, the idea of data being used to advocate for more physical activity in schools. This is a really, really important thing. And whether we're writing a grant proposal or going to a school board for more resources, having data to drive those advocacy efforts is extremely important, and local level data is the most valuable in these scenarios. I also want to point out here the idea of extend, expand, and enhance. And this idea was published back in 2016 by Michael Beetz and colleagues. The idea is looking at, in this case, physical activity promotion from an idea of the 3 E's. So how can we extend or add on more time to existing physical activity opportunities so that kids can get more physical activity? How can we expand on the current program offerings that we have? So if we don't currently have an intramural program, could we potentially add something like that to offer a new physical activity opportunity? And the idea of enhancement. How can we take the current physical activity programs that are available and make them even better? Let's say, how could we increase the amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity offered in after-school programs by using some of the strategies that we know work from the research? Okay. And so the data can help drive some of those things around extending, expanding, and enhancing our physical activity program opportunities. In addition, we can also look at data in terms of driving our individual efforts to promote physical activity among kids. And this model that you see here is a response to intervention model for preventive school health. And the idea being here that we can use individual student level data, and we can then have tiered interventions that we develop to help kids meet recommendations who may not be meeting them just with the standard level of intervention. And so we think of a tier 1 as that standard level, and then we might have more intensive interventions in tier 2 and tier 3 for the kids and students that are not meeting physical activity recommendations or other health behaviors. This model was later expanded to not only look at kids that might be struggling to meet physical activity recommendations, but also to continue to challenge the students that are at the higher end in terms of physical activity engagement. And so we want to make sure that those kids too have opportunities for enrichment activities and for really pushing them forward in their own physical activity goals. And so there's many ideas for how this can be done. This article was published in JOPER back in 2017, and it talks about the standard curriculum instruction that all students receive. And then you have your enrichment on the right-hand side, and you have your supplemental instruction on the left-hand side with ideas for interventions that can be done for kids. So in terms of looking at local level data, I like to use this data to knowledge continuum to really drive home the point that we need to be collecting a variety of data in schools to know if what we're doing is having the impact that we desire. But typically what ends up happening is schools collect data, but have difficulty transitioning it from data into knowledge and into action. And so there's been some research that's been done on this in terms of a process for engaging with data after they're collected. And the big picture is we want our data to become actionable. So we have to spend time organizing it, analyzing it, prioritizing it, and then really using it to inform all the work that we do in schools. So we know that there's research evidence. I talked a little bit about some of the limitations that we have in terms of what we can truly get out of the research. And then in terms of evidence-based practice, I talked about how the local school context, the resources, the desires of the school community, that those things really need to be considered, and how we have to look to local data to also inform evidence-based practices in an ongoing manner. So research is constantly being done, and we can always be using that to drive the decisions that we make, but we also have to have that local level data to continue to let us know whether the things that we're doing in the schools are having the type of effects that we want. Okay, so in this presentation, we covered evidence-based practice. We looked at what works in schools from sort of a systematic review and research synthesis standpoint, and then we talked about how we can capitalize on local data. Before I finish off the presentation today, I always like to acknowledge the people that have had an impact on my career. And so I want to start with Kim Graber, professor at University of Illinois, who I got to work with during my undergraduate days. Dolly Lambden and Xiaofan Keating at the University of Texas, who guided me through my graduate studies. And then Russ Carson, who was with me at University of Northern Colorado and is now at Playcorps. Their mentorship has been greatly appreciated over the years and has been very valuable. I'd also like to take a minute to acknowledge the UNC Active Schools Institute team at the University of Northern Colorado. They've been instrumental in a lot of the work that I shared today and in my thinking over the years, so I'm extremely grateful for my team here at UNC. And again, I'd like to thank IOHSK for inviting me to be a part of the conference this year. I'm looking forward to seeing all the presentations. And again, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.